All right, so thank you everyone for attending the first session for the Athletes Commission webinars. We're excited to host Colin Ryan, People's Pharmacy here and discuss about the importance of education in sports and in sports pharmacy specifically. Just a little intro to the Athletes Commission. The Bermuda Athletes Commission is run by the Bermuda Olympic Association, and we welcome all athletes and athlete representatives to the first of two sessions on the online webinars. Our Athletes Commission is responsible for promoting the rights of the athletes, supporting the engagement of the athletes on and off the field of play, representing the interests of our athletes, making sure that we're making the related recommendations to the correct individuals or organizations. We're consulting with athletes regarding any rules or regulations and collaborating with the BOA General Assembly, the IOC Athletes Commission, and the Pan American Sports Athletes Commission. So that's kind of who we are as an umbrella. We service the specific for Olympic sports events, which are the Olympics, the Pan American Games, Commonwealth Games, and the CAC Games. So we're excited to host you guys on the first of two sessions. And a little introduction to Colin before he starts. He completed his master's degree in pharmacy at the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland. He currently works at People's Pharmacy. He has a background in sport, in Gaelic football and in football on the Ireland national level. And he also is a competitor for Robin Hood Football Club locally on Ireland. He was the 2017 MVP in the All-Star game, and he recently completed his IOC Drugs in Sport course, which is kind of led for this communication between the Athletes Commission and Colin. So I'd like to thank Colin for attending and open the floor for the sports pharmacy talk.
Thank you very much, Julian, for the introduction, and thanks to everybody for joining us here today. As Julian mentioned, my name is Colin Ryan. I'm the lead pharmacist at People's Pharmacy at the hospital. And yeah, what we're here to talk about today is drugs in sport. As Julian mentioned, I'm from Ireland and I still have quite a bit of the accent, as you can tell. So Zoom doesn't have any subtitles feature just yet. So if there are any questions about anything that I'm saying, please feel free to add it into the chat and we'll do our best to address it. In terms of what we're going to look at today, firstly, we're going to look at my background and how I came to be involved in drugs in sport. We're going to identify some of the problems that can be connected to drugs in sport and look at some relevant examples of athletes who have had those particular problems. We're going to investigate whether sports pharmacy can act as a guide to help us to figure out a way to find some solutions to these problems. And finally, we're going to look at some next steps for you to take, some practical steps that can be taken after today to gain some tangible benefits from it. So a little bit about my background. Julian has touched on some of this already, but just to give a brief overview. So I'm from the northwest of Ireland and grew up playing both football, soccer, and Gaelic football, which I guess is a combination of rugby and soccer and netball and a whole host of other sports. A fantastic sport. But underage and as a youth, I primarily played soccer or football and was with the academy with Sligo Rovers, which you may be familiar with. That is a club that Dante Leverock, the current national team captain, was with in Ireland a couple of years ago. So after finishing high school, I moved to Dublin to start my pharmacy degree. That was at the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland. And at this point, I stopped playing as much soccer and started focusing more on Gaelic football. So I completed my master's in the Royal College of Surgeons and started working at a community pharmacy in Dublin. And it was throughout these years, throughout my 20s, that I was playing Gaelic football at a national level at that point. And it was really then that I became concerned at the discrepancy between the way drugs were treated in the work environment and how they were treated in the dressing room or by some athletes that I was coming into contact with. And just to say at this point, when I say drugs in sport, I mean over-the-counter medications, prescription medications, and supplements as well. So it's those whole host of supplements we're discussing. So when I moved to Bermuda, as Julian mentioned, I started playing football with Robin Hood and have had a couple of very successful years with a great bunch of lads there. And I also met Craig Brown, who's involved with the Bermuda Olympic Association Medical Committee, and I became involved with that last year. As part of that, I started doing the International Olympic Committee Drugs and Sport course, and that has really helped me to get a framework to identify the problems with drugs in sport, and also to try and suggest some potential solutions for these problems. So in terms of the main problems that we're going to look at today, the three we're going to address are number one, doping, number two, adverse drug reactions, and number three, suboptimal performance. So I guess just to say at this point, having been in a high performance environment, I understand the amount of dedication and commitment it takes for athletes to compete at that level and at the level that those of you who are joining us today as athletes are competing at. What we want to ensure is that we can give you the tools to make sure you don't fall foul of any of the problems that we're going to discuss at this point. So after we looked at the problems, here, we're going to investigate the potential solutions for them as well. So the first problem we'll look at is doping. As I'm sure most of you are aware, the World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, prepares an annual list of prohibited substances and methods that are not allowed for use in sports. So there are a number of different agencies that deal with doping, and I know Bermuda Sports Anti-Doping Agency is on the line here. I'm not going to focus too much on advertent doping here today, or intentional doping. The main focus for me is going to be inadvertent doping. So again, just to be completely upfront and clear, obviously I'm completely against doping and for clean sport, but what I'm going to focus on today is the inadvertent doping. And this is where an athlete who is not intending to cheat the system still makes a mistake and then suffers the consequences of having an adverse, an anti-doping rule violation. So again, to me, it is completely unacceptable that someone would miss potentially the biggest match of their career, the biggest games of their career, due to an unintentional error. And what we are trying to do today is to avoid this happening to anyone. A good example of this, a very recent example of this, is from football. A gentleman called Andre Onana, who is the Ajax and Cameroon international goalkeeper. He is a high-profile player in Europe. He had a recent valuation of 36 million euro. For that, he was found to have had furosemide in his system after a drugs test, and UEFA, the governing body, gave him a 12-month ban from footballing activities. Now, for this, Mr. Onana claimed, and UEFA accepted, that it was an unintentional doping violation. He had woken up one morning, he was not feeling particularly well. He went to take an aspirin from the medicine cabinet, and instead of taking the aspirin, he selected his wife's furosemide medication, which was shown to be in a very, very similar packaged bottle. So for that, again, UEFA did accept that it was not intentional, but as there is the concept of strict liability, where the athlete is solely responsible for the supplements or for the substances that end up in their body, they still found that he would need to serve this 12-month ban. Again, we've looked at some of the repercussions from this. So again, there's a suspension that comes into play. But on top of this, there's also the reputational damage. Once someone is tarnished as a potential doper, again, it's very, very hard to put that genie back in the bottle. So what we want to do is to prevent those problems from happening in the first place. And along with this, one other serious repercussion, naturally enough, is the financial impact of this doping. So again, Mr. Onana is unable to play football for 12 months, and where he had been linked with a transfer to some of Europe's biggest clubs during the coming transfer window, he will be unable to do so. And so both himself and the organization that he represents are taking a serious financial hit. One major takeaway point that I'd like to again emphasize here is this is something that is completely avoidable, and we are going to look at how something like this will be avoided just a little bit. The second problem we're going to address today is adverse drug reactions, and I'm including side effects of drugs in this. The WHO, the World Health Organization, defines an adverse drug reaction as the response to a drug which is noxious and unintended. So again, this is taking a drug or a medication and it having a negative health impact on the athlete. A good example of this, it's worth remembering that medication is controlled often by prescriptions for a reason, that any medication that has an effect can have side effects and can have serious side effects in some situations. Good example to start with is something like blood pressure medication. So if you think of a person taking blood pressure medication to bring their blood pressure down from too high to an acceptable level, again, if too much is taken or if the dose is too strong, the blood pressure can drop to below this normal healthy range, which in itself can cause issues such as dizziness and falls and dangers when driving and so on. So again, it is important to remember that drugs need to be respected and treated with care, and some potential impacts from adverse drug reactions include these negative health impacts and again, potential player unavailability. One other brief example of an adverse drug reaction would be an anaphylactic or an allergic reaction to taking a medication. If someone is allergic to penicillin and they take penicillin, they can have an anaphylactic reaction. Again, if this happens to an athlete, it can have impacts on their potential to train and compete. There can be repercussions also in terms of reputational damage. This is more from an organizational point of view, where as an organization, there's a duty of care to the athletes. So it is important that policies and procedures are in place to ensure that medication is being treated appropriately at each individual step. So a very relevant example of an adverse drug reaction in terms of a former athlete is the former Liverpool defender, Daniel Agger. So he is an elite athlete who won 75 caps for his country, Denmark, a number of these as the captain. When he was undertaking a preseason match with Liverpool, he was involved in a training ground incident. He got injured and started using non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs to help treat the pain and inflammation. Now, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, or NSAIDs, as I have there, are very commonly used medications and can be extremely effective for pain and inflammation. But there are serious side effects with their overuse and with their use over a prolonged period of time. So it is very important that these are used appropriately and with care. That wasn't the scenario for Mr. Agger. He was and has gone on record himself in a number of interviews as saying he took too much of the medication and for a more prolonged period of time than was recommended by his doctors. So for that, it had a negative impact, not just on his health, but also on his performance as well. So in his final match, as a professional footballer, he was actually captain for that game. He had taken too many non-steroidal anti-inflammatories before the game. He tried to even out the drowsiness and the dizziness he felt by taking some caffeine. And it got to the point where when he gave his team talk before the match, his teammates were unable to understand what he was saying. He was incoherent. When he went onto the pitch, he was out of sync with what was happening around him. he was misjudging the flight of the ball and bumping into both opposition players and teammates to the extent that he had to be substituted after 29 minutes. So again, this is a great example of an athlete's performance being negatively impacted, but also their health. So again, the dizziness and the drowsiness that comes along with the adverse drug reaction. One final point, again, to emphasize is this is something that is completely avoidable by appropriate monitoring of medication use by athletes. The third and final problem that we're going to address in terms of drugs in sport is suboptimal performance. This is where an athlete is unable to reach their peak performance due to the inappropriate use of medication. Oftentimes, and by far the most common factor in this, is medication non-adherence, which is where an athlete is either not taking their medication appropriately or is not taking their medication at all. So again, when we think of athletes, we often think of young, fit, healthy individuals. But athletes are still susceptible to long-term health conditions such as asthma, diabetes, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and so on. It has been shown that up to 50% of people who are taking medications for long-term conditions don't use their medication correctly. And while if you're a member of the general public, this obviously has an effect on your health. If you're an athlete, this impacts upon your health, number one, and your ability to train and compete, number two. Now, it is worth pointing out here and important to point out that the number one focus in all of this as healthcare professionals, from our point of view, has to be the athlete's health. Number one, they're a human being, first and foremost, and an athlete, secondly. So some of the repercussions from suboptimal performance can be a negative health impact, unavailability of players, and again, reputational damage potentially to the organization. A very easy example here is for an athlete who has uncontrolled asthma. And again, asthma is actually more common among athletes than among the general population. If an athlete is not using their preventative inhaler, they will be unable to train. They will have more regular flare-ups or attacks of their asthma. And if an athlete is unable to train regularly and to the maximum, they will be unable to compete to the maximum as well. An interesting example of this would be Ravel Morrison, who was a football star, Manchester United player, who made his debut for the first team at the age of 17 and was tipped to be a generational superstar, with Sir Alex Ferguson saying he had as much natural talent as any youngster that United had ever signed. Now, it came out in a court case a number of years later that Mr. Morrison had been diagnosed with ADHD and was not taking his medication as a result, allegedly, of some advice received from an advisor. So for that, he was unable to regulate his behavior appropriately. His behavior was negatively impacted, and he was unable to train and reach his peak performance, to the extent that at the age of 28, he is now without a club. It is worth pointing out at this stage that the WADA list that we mentioned earlier, and there are some potential exemptions to that. For ADHD, a lot of the medications that are used to treat this condition are on the WADA prohibited list. Things like Ritalin and Concerta are in the amphetamine class of medication and are on the banned list. But there is an exemption called a therapeutic use exemption, whereby if an athlete has a confirmed medical need for the medication, if the medication is not going to enhance their performance beyond a return to normal, and if there is no suitable alternative to this medication, it can be given. So it is something to wonder whether Mr. Morrison could have potentially had a different career had he been able to use this medication. So sports pharmacy is something we're going to see if it could act as a guide and if we can learn some of the lessons from pharmacy and transfer them to sport to prevent the problems that we have just address there. Sports pharmacy is something that originated in Japan as a concept and was promoted heavily by the Japan Anti-Doping Agency. In 2010, they started a sports pharmacy program with the idea that any athlete who had a query on any medication or any supplement would be able to contact and speak directly to a sports pharmacist anytime, anywhere, and they would be able to help with the medication query or concern. In recent years, this has become a lot more popular, and it's now something that is beginning to gain traction and recognition on a worldwide basis. So in terms of the solutions that a sports pharmacy is presenting, they can be broken down into three strands. Firstly, education. Second, medicines management. And third, direct athlete support. So again, we want to point out at this point that the reason we want to look at each of these solutions is to ensure that no athlete misses a big competition or a meet or heaven forbid a games or an Olympic Games, or that they suffer in terms of their health and safety as a result of any of the avoidable problems. In terms of education, number one, it's important with any issue to firstly identify the problem and to be aware of it. And hopefully this talk today will help to do that. Education is a wide-ranging thing, and there's so many different aspects to education for drugs in sport. And again, I know that Bermuda Sports Anti-Doping Agency do great work in this area. In terms of two takeaway points that I would love to emphasize today, the first one would be to always read and heed the label of any medication. So if you look at a couple of the athletes we spoke about earlier, for example, Onana, the goalkeeper for Ajax, had he taken the time to read the medication, he would have realized this isn't the medication that he was due to take. And again, the whole issue would have been avoided. Secondly, heeding the label is just as important as reading it. These medications are controlled by prescriptions with valid reason, and the information that's provided with them is there for valid reason, and that is to protect the patient's health. So again, had Daniel Agger stuck to the instruction on the bottle in terms of the max amount to be used per day and the max length of use, again, it's an issue that wouldn't have arisen. The second key point would be to never ever take other people's medications. Again, Mr. Onana made that mistake in taking his wife's medication. But even if problem seems potentially the same, there's a reason that consultations with healthcare professionals like doctors are needed before medication is given. And that's to ensure that the medication is going to be suitable for use for that individual. So again, never taking other people's medication is the second point to reiterate. In terms of education, we also need to look at the resources to help make life easier for athletes. The first one, and a very helpful and important one, is globaldro.com. So this is one that can be used for any over-the-counter or prescription medications to check whether it is appropriate for use in terms of anti-doping. So again, an athlete can go on to globaldro.com. They can put in their status as an athlete and the sport they compete in and search for the medication that they are debating or thinking about using. And the database will show up whether that medication is prohibited for use by them or otherwise. In terms of the second resource we're looking at, it is informedsport.com. For informedsport.com, whereas Global DRO deals with prescription and over-the-counter medications, informedsport.com and many others like it deal with supplements. And supplements are one that, as a healthcare professional, are quite a tricky one, because there is a huge discrepancy and a huge imbalance in the amount of regulation between a prescription medication and a supplement. The amount of regulation for a supplement is much, much lower, and the amount of oversight is again much lower, which can cause to potential issues. So the level of contamination of products is something that is a real concern with supplements. So steps should be taken by the athlete to try and minimize any problem that they have or any potential problem with contamination. What something like informedsport.com does, it runs an independent laboratory. So you can, as an athlete, log on to informedsport.com, type in the name of the product you're considering using. So for example, your whey protein, Optimum Nutrition whey protein, it will say whether that is one that informedsport.com laboratory does check, and whether the batch that you're considering using has been checked by the laboratory. So again, this doesn't bring the risk to zero. It doesn't mean there's no chance of having issues down the line with it. But again, it is a step to minimize or reduce that risk, because the reality is we know that athletes are going to continue to use supplements in the attempt to improve their performance. Secondly, medicines management. There are two different aspects of medicines management. The first one is with an organization, and again, this would be checking that an organization has appropriate policies and procedures in place around their use of medications, and for each step from procuring it through to storing it and dispensing it and disposing of it. But from an athlete's point of view, the medicines use review is the main aspect of this, which is the MUR. So this is effectively a review of every medication, over-the-counter and prescription and supplement that an athlete is taking. It would involve a sit down with a sports pharmacist where the use of each medication and supplement is discussed, along with the need for it and whether it's being used safely and appropriately. So again, this is a service that we are looking to provide for the first 5 athletes who register. We'll be sending out an email after this talk, and you can sign up to it. The details will be contained in the email, and the first 5 athletes will be able to sign up for a medicines use review, which will go through whether those medications that are being used or those supplements that are being used, whether they're being used appropriately and safely. The final solution we're going to look at is direct athlete support. So for that, this is a direct messaging service from an athlete to a sports pharmacist. So again, this would be via regular messaging service like WhatsApp or along those lines. If an athlete had a specific query or concern about a medication they were about to take, they would use the messaging service to contact the sports pharmacist, relay their query, and the pharmacist would let them know from, number one, a doping point of view, and number two, a health and safety point of view, if the medication was appropriate for use. So if we look at these 3 different solutions, you have the education, the medicines management, and the direct athlete support. Had the athletes that had the issues previously, had they used these different solutions, they wouldn't have fallen foul of the particular problems. So in terms of Andre Onana, the goalkeeper, again, he should have been educated to know to read the label before ever taking medication. And secondly, if he had been had access to direct athlete support, he could have sent a message with a WhatsApp photo of the medication he was about to take to a sports pharmacist, who would have said, under no circumstances are you to take this medication. For Daniel Agger, this would be more a medicines management point of view, where with a medicines use review, you would see that the amount of anti-inflammatories being used was, number one, too high, and the length of time it was being used for was too long. So again, this is where the solution would have helped avoid those particular problems. Again, similar to the medicines use review, the first 5 athletes who want to sign up for the direct athlete support can do so, and again, the details will be in the email. In terms of practical next steps for you to take from today's talk to get some tangible benefits, Again, you will be asked to access the email that will be sent to you and to download and use the resources that are attached. This is going to include globaldro.com and informsport.com, and also an app that can be downloaded directly onto your phone. So the next time you're in a pharmacy, you have a head cold and you want to see if Sudafed, for example, is okay for use, you can go onto your app, put Sudafed in there, and it will let you know whether it is okay for use from an anti-doping point of view or otherwise. And secondly, to avail of the free services, again, for the first 5 athletes who sign up for both the medicines use review and the direct athlete support, it is a service we will provide and we will organize in the coming weeks. So in summary, what we looked at today were the potential problems with the use of drugs in sport, primarily doping, and again, focusing on inadvertent doping or unintentional doping. We looked at adverse drug reactions and suboptimal performance, and then relevant examples of athletes who have suffered from these issues, including Andre Onana, Daniel Agger, and Ravel Morris. We examined whether sports pharmacy could act as a guide to help prevent these problems in the future, and some of the solutions we can take from pharmacy, including education, medicines management, and direct athlete support. Finally, we discussed some of the next steps that I would encourage you to take in terms of looking at the resources and the free services that can be availed of afterwards. So that is everything from my point of view today. Thank you very much for your time and your attention. And as Julian mentioned, if there are any questions, we'd be delighted to take them.
Thank you, Colin. Appreciate it. And I'd just like to add, one of the important reasons why this is a priority for you, the athlete, is because you're responsible at the end of the day for knowing what you put or ingest in your body. So that's kind of segues into resources available that we have on island, so that you can know exactly what the restrictions are, what the rules are, whether it's for prescription drugs, like Colin said, the adverse reactions to prescription drugs, or whether it's for over-the-counter supplements, knowing what you ingest in your body, where that comes from, the dangers of supplements, and potentially having tainted supplements that you're putting in your body. It's very important as an athlete that you don't subject your athletic career to a ban from the anti-doping agency because you weren't aware and you weren't educated. And I'll just give a couple examples. I have some good ones that I've written down, but Ryan Lochte, for example, in swimming, he's a 4-time Olympian, 12-time Olympic medalist, and at 33 years old in 2018, he posted an image of himself at an IV bar with intravenous vitamins that he was putting in his body, which was banned by the United States Anti-Doping Agency and against the WADA code. Basically, no athletes could receive intravenous therapy over 100 milliliters over a 12-month period. He was unaware of that, and this was just a vitamin mixture that he was putting in his body, and he got a 12-month suspension for not knowing and for posting this photo, incriminating himself on social media, basically giving him a ban, and he wasn't able to compete for the World Championships the following year. And that's just one example of knowing what you put in your body. The second example, also that's important to this group, is one of the restrictions on athletes, or one of the procedures for elite athletes in Bermuda, is once you get to an elite level in your sport, you're subject to filing whereabouts with Bermuda Sports Anti-Doping. So all the information on the whereabouts is going to be on Adams, which is a website that you can go on to file your whereabouts. All the information on basically on the drugs and whereabouts and Global Dro are on BASADA's website at basada.org, so you can find more information about therapeutic use exemptions, WADA anti-doping code, the rights and responsibilities for the athletes, and also what the whereabouts require. And another example of an athlete failing to file their whereabouts correctly is recently the US sprinter Christian Coleman. He's a world champion in the 100 meters, had 3 filing failures in 2019. So he's never failed a drug test, but because he had 3 filing failures within a 12-month period, he had a 2-year suspension. So that was in 2019, and he's now suspended and cannot compete at the Olympic Games. And he's the defending champion in the 100 meters. You know, and this just comes down to knowing how to file, knowing how to submit your whereabouts, what the requirements are for you as an elite athlete. And, you know, there are really no excuses around, you know, not showing up on, you know, on one whereabouts location test. You know, I mean, the fact that this elite athlete had 3, you know, is a completely different story. And, you know, I can kind of go into more detail about that, but you can read up about Christian Coleman specifically and his filing failures online. So those are 2 kind of examples or case studies that we need to take and understand. These are the reasons why we're paying attention to what we're putting in our bodies and why we need to be educated around sports. So that's kind of what ties it into basically you as an athlete. You know, there's a few sports on here, you know, that are probably curious around the anti-doping procedures. You know, if you have any questions for me, for Colin, we also have Debbie Hunter on the call from BASADA. So thank you, Debbie, for joining. If you guys, as athletes, have any questions to either of us, you can either shoot us an email, you can ask in the chat board below, but feel free to continue this communication after this webinar and shoot me an email if you have questions. I can direct you, and the National Olympic Committee Athletes Commission can direct you in the right direction to where your question can be answered. So yeah, I think that kind of recaps the session that we have today. Does anyone have any immediate questions for Colin while we're on the call? Or Debbie or myself?
Thing was pretty straightforward. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
I'm gonna put you on spotlight. Hold on a second.
Thank you.
I just learned this morning.
Yes, I'm still learning too, Joe. Yeah, I'm still learning. Good afternoon, everyone. Just want to say that this was a great presentation. Colin, thank you so much. Because during the time when I was competing, I had a lot of questions about medications. Of course, nowadays we are so much more advanced than when I competed in 1976, so I'm not giving away my age. But yes, I am above 60. But I think this is also a great opportunity for BASADA to then have a continued or more, I would say, robust partnership with the Athletes Commission, with the BOA, so that we make sure that we address all of the concerns, because no concern is too small. And I think that this is a great opportunity. We are now looking at maybe possibly rolling out our information in a different way due to COVID, by virtual means and the like. And so I look forward to both you, Julian and Colin, to have future conversations. And thank you for mentioning the TUE. Very important. And I just want to stress to many here on the call, and maybe they can also tell their friends, we look forward to receiving any calls at BASADA. We're not only there to collect urine, they say, to be punitive, but we want to help as many as possible, because I too was in the same situation as you are right now with the unknowns in sport. So I look forward to our continued relationship. I look forward to supplying additional information to the Athlete Commission. And thank you for having me join today. It's very informative. Thank you, Colin.
Thank you. Thanks, Debbie.
Great.
Yeah, thank you, Debbie. Thank you, Colin. I also want to thank Cheyenne Smith, who's part of the Athletes Commission, for attending as well. Thank you, Cheyenne. I hope you found it informative
Yes.
as well.
Yes, yes, it was good.
Great. And for those of you who weren't here at the beginning of the call, we've recorded the entire session, so we're going to be posting it on our website at www.bermudaathletes.com, and we'll also send an email out with the link to our resources. So thank you all for attending, and hope you guys have a great weekend.
Thanks, Julian. Thank you, everyone.
Stay safe, everyone.
Cheers, guys.
Thank you.
See you, folks.